March 17, 1945. The morning frost clings to the shattered cobblestones of a nameless village 30 kilometers west of the Rhine. The air smells of diesel exhaust and wet earth, mingled with the acrid tang of cordite that never quite leaves the nostrils of men who live inside steel coffins. In a narrow street lined with the skeletal remains of half-timbered houses, a lone M4 Sherman tank sits motionless, its 75mm gun elevated toward the gray sky. Inside, 5 American soldiers wait in the cramped darkness, listening to the distant rumble that every tanker has learned to fear, the deep, mechanical growl of a German Panther approaching through the morning mist. The Sherman's commander, a 23-year-old lieutenant from Pennsylvania, peers through his periscope with hands that no longer tremble. He has been in Europe for 7 months. He has seen 22 men from his original company die. He has watched 3 Shermans burn with crews trapped inside, their screams cutting through the radio static. And he has heard, in a dozen different accents across a dozen different battlefields, the same bitter joke that circulates through every American armored unit from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. The Sherman is a damn fine tank, if you can get 5 of them against 1 German. But on this morning, in this forgotten village, the lieutenant commands something different. His Sherman is not the standard M for that landed on the beaches of Normandy 9 months earlier. Is not the undergunned, under-armored vehicle that earned the macabre nickname Ronson. Lights first time every time from the British troops who watched them burn across the bocage of France. This Sherman wears a new designation stenciled in white paint on its glassy plate, M4A3E8. The Americans call it the Easy 8. And in the brutal mathematics of armored warfare that has governed the Western Front since June of 1944, it represents something the Germans did not anticipate, something their doctrine did not account for, something their veteran panzer crews have only recently begun to fear: American adaptation. To understand the transformation that occurs in this village, in 1,000 villages like it across the dying landscape of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945, one must journey backward through the smoke and failure of 3 years of American tank warfare. One must return to the drawing boards of the Detroit Arsenal, to the doctrinal debates in the War Department, to the fundamental miscalculation that nearly cost the United States its armored advantage in Europe. One must understand how the Sherman, designed as a weapon of mobility and mass production, became instead a symbol of American industrial might trapped in a cage of its own making, and how a nation that prided itself on technological superiority found itself sending young men into battle in machines that German tankers dismissed with casual contempt. The story begins not in 1945, but in 1940, when the world first witnessed what modern armored warfare could achieve. In May of that year, German panzer divisions tore through France in 6 weeks, bypassing the Maginot Line and demonstrating that the tank was no longer merely an infantry support weapon, but the spearhead of a new kind of war: fast, violent, and decisive. American military planners watched this blitzkrieg with alarm and fascination. The United States Army, still recovering from 2 decades of peacetime neglect, possessed exactly 464 tanks in 1940, most of them obsolete light vehicles with riveted armor and machine guns. The nation that had pioneered mass production now faced the humbling reality that it possessed virtually no modern armored force worthy of the name. The response was characteristically American: ambitious, pragmatic, and rooted in industrial capacity rather than martial tradition. The Army's Ordnance Department, working with automotive engineers from the private sector, designed the M4 Sherman around principles that seemed unassailable in 1941. The tank would be reliable, mechanically simple, easy to maintain, and above all, easy to mass produce. It would use a proven radial aircraft engine, simple bogie suspension, and a modest 75mm gun, sufficient to defeat any tank the Germans had fielded in France. Most importantly, it would be built in numbers that would overwhelm any qualitative advantage the enemy might possess. By 1942, American factories were producing Shermans at a rate that stunned even the most optimistic planners, more than 2,000 per month at peak production, rolling off assembly lines from Detroit to California, shipped across oceans in numbers that transformed military logistics into a science of abundance. The German tank crews who first encountered Shermans in North Africa in 1942 found them formidable enough opponents. The British-operated Shermans that fought at El Alamein could penetrate the armor of the Panzer III and Panzer IV at combat ranges, and their reliability in the desert environment far exceeded that of German vehicles. American crews who landed in North Africa during Operation Torch discovered that their Shermans could hold their own against the Afrika Korps, though the emergence of the German Tiger tank in Tunisia provided an ominous preview of what was to come. Still, in the North African campaign, the Sherman's advantages, reliability, crew comfort, excellent optics, and the gyrostabilized gun that allowed firing on the move, seemed to justify the design philosophy. Quantity had a quality all its own, American commanders believed, and the Sherman embodied that principle. But North Africa was a war of movement across open terrain, where maneuver and logistics mattered as much as armor and firepower. Europe would be different. Europe would be hedgerows and stone villages, narrow streets and bocage so dense that engagement ranges collapsed from 1,000 yards to 100. Europe would be Tigers and Panthers, German tanks designed not in 1940, but in 1942 and 1943, after the Wehrmacht had learned the brutal lessons of the Eastern Front. And in Europe, the Sherman's fundamental deficiencies would be written in fire and blood across the fields of France and the forests of Germany. The German tankers who faced the Normandy invasion in June 1944 came to the battle with 3 years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, where they had learned to respect the Soviet T-34's combination of armor, firepower, and mobility. They had learned to fear the Joseph Stalin heavy tanks with their 122mm guns. They had developed tactics, refined doctrine, and designed new vehicles specifically to counter these threats. When the first Shermans rolled off the invasion beaches onto French soil, veteran Panzer crews assessed them with professional interest and reached conclusions that would prove both accurate and devastating. A German tank commander named Hans von Luck, leading a reconnaissance battalion in Normandy, recorded his impressions in a memoir written decades after the war. "We were surprised by the technical inferiority of the American Sherman," he wrote. "Our Panther tanks could destroy them at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun could not even penetrate our frontal armor." The statistics compiled by American armored units in France confirm these grim assessments. In the fighting across Normandy from June to August 1944, American tank losses reached catastrophic levels. Third Army's 4th Armored Division lost 186 Shermans in 2 months of combat. The 2nd Armored Division lost 232 tanks between D-Day and the end of August. First Army's armored divisions reported loss rates that exceeded 500%, every Sherman in the inventory destroyed and replaced 5 times over during the campaign. Individual actions revealed the tactical nightmare that American crews faced. At Villers-Bocage on June 13th, a single German Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed approximately 25 Allied vehicles, including multiple Shermans, in the span of 15 minutes. At Goodwood in mid-July, British armored divisions lost over 300 tanks in a single day, many of them Shermans, to German anti-tank guns and Panthers positioned in defensive depth. The men who fought inside these Shermans understood the mathematics of their predicament with terrible clarity. Technical intelligence reports circulated through American armored units detailing the penetration capabilities of German tank guns versus the protection offered by Sherman armor. A Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. A Tiger's 88mm gun could do so at 3,000 yards. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at exactly 0 yards. The plate was immune at all combat ranges. To kill a Panther, a Sherman crew had to maneuver to the side or rear, closing to point-blank range while under fire from a weapon that could destroy them with a single hit. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. American tankers went into battle knowing that in any frontal engagement with a German heavy tank, they would almost certainly die. Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, wrote an account of the Normandy campaign that strips away any illusion about what this meant in human terms. "I had seen the results," Cooper wrote. Shermans with holes punched clean through them, front to back. Turrets blown 30 feet from the hull. Interiors burned so completely that nothing remained but ash and metal fittings of what had once been 5 men. The worst were the ones that brewed up, caught fire, but didn't explode. You could hear the ammunition cooking off inside, and sometimes you could hear the screaming too, if any of the crew were still alive. We learned not to approach burning Shermans. There was nothing we could do, and the ammunition would explode for hours. Yet the tankers kept fighting. They developed tactics born of desperation and courage. They learned to hunt in packs, using terrain and maneuver to compensate for the Sherman's technical inferiority. They learned that speed and numbers could overwhelm a superior vehicle if they were willing to accept the losses. For Shermans would engage a Panther from the front, drawing its fire and attention, while a fifth maneuvered to the flank for the killing shot. The tactics worked after a fashion, but the cost was written in the casualty reports. The 743rd Tank Battalion, which landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, lost 92% of its original tank crews killed or wounded by the time it reached Germany. The 2nd Armored Division's casualty rate among tank crews exceeded 150%, every position filled, emptied by death or wounds, and filled again multiple times over. The soldiers accepted these odds with a fatalism that bordered on resignation, but they did not suffer silently. Letters flowed back from the front to the War Department, to congressmen, to newspapers. "Why are we fighting in tanks that are 3 years obsolete?" wrote one lieutenant to his senator. "The Germans are killing us with weapons we cannot match. We have the factories. We have the workers. Why in God's name don't we have the tanks?" The complaints reached General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, who pressed the Ordnance Department for answers. The responses he received revealed a bureaucracy trapped between competing imperatives, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the crisis. The Army's official position, maintained well into 1944, was that the Sherman was adequate for its intended role. The 75mm gun was sufficient for infantry support, which doctrine designated as the tank's primary mission. Heavy enemy tanks were supposed to be engaged by specialized tank destroyers, not by regular Sherman units. This doctrinal distinction, however elegant on paper, collapsed on contact with reality. German Panthers and Tigers did not politely wait to be engaged by American tank destroyers. They engaged whatever targets presented themselves, and those targets were predominantly Shermans. The tank destroyer doctrine, which had seemed so logical in the abstract, proved a costly fiction in practice. Moreover, the Ordnance Department argued production considerations made major design changes impossible. The Sherman production line was a masterpiece of industrial efficiency, feeding an insatiable demand not just from American forces, but from British, Free French, Soviet, and other Allied armies. To stop production, to retool for a new design, would create gaps in supply that the enemy might exploit. Better to accept some casualties from technical inferiority than to risk losing momentum in the campaign. And finally, there was the question of logistics. The Sherman's greatest virtue was its reliability and the ease with which it could be maintained and supplied. A new tank design might offer better armor and firepower, but if it broke down constantly or required specialized parts that took months to reach the front, it would be worse than useless. These arguments had merit, but they felt hollow to the men who burned. By late summer 1944, the complaints from the field had reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. General George Patton, never one for bureaucratic niceties, sent a blistering message to the War Department: "The Sherman is a death trap. We need tanks that can fight German tanks on equal terms, and we need them now. I don't care about production schedules. I care about winning this war without needlessly sacrificing my men." The response, when it finally came, was not a new tank, but a series of modifications to the existing design, incremental improvements that reflected both the urgency of the crisis and the constraints of industrial reality. Some Sherman units in France received the M4A3 variant, which replaced the gasoline engine with a diesel, significantly reducing the tendency to catch fire. Others received the 76mm high-velocity gun, which could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at close range and its side armor at combat distances. British crews welded additional armor plates to their Sherman's hulls and turrets, improvised field modifications that added protection at the cost of mobility. American maintenance units followed suit, creating hybrid vehicles that bore little resemblance to the factory specifications. But these were expedients, not solutions. The 76mm gun Sherman, while better armed, retained the same fundamental weaknesses: thin armor, high profile, and vulnerability to even medium German anti-tank weapons. Crews called it the same coffin with a bigger gun. The up-armored variants were slower, more prone to mechanical failure, and still inadequate against Tiger and Panther frontal armor. What the tankers needed, what they pleaded for in letters and reports and desperate conversations with visiting brass, was not an improved Sherman, but a genuinely new tank, designed from the ground up to match German heavy armor. That tank existed. In the summer of 1944, the T-26E3, later designated the M26 Pershing, was undergoing trials at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. It mounted a 90mm gun capable of penetrating any German tank in service. It carried frontal armor thick enough to defeat the Panther's 75mm gun at most combat ranges. It was, by any measure, the tank American crews needed. But the Pershing would not reach Europe in significant numbers until March 1945, less than 2 months before Germany's surrender. The reasons for this delay, procurement debates, shipping priorities, mechanical teething problems, are complex and much debated by historians. What is not debatable is the cost. Thousands of American tankers fought and died in Shermans during the autumn and winter of 1944-45 who might have survived in Pershings. Yet the story of the Sherman's transformation, the answer to German laughter and American desperation, did not come from the Pershing. It came instead from a series of modifications so practical, so elegantly simple, that they represented both an indictment of earlier design decisions and a vindication of American engineering when freed from doctrinal constraints. In the closing months of 1944, engineers at the Detroit Arsenal and the Fisher Tank Arsenal began work on what they called the M4A3E8, the 8 designation indicating the 8th major experimental modification to the M4A3 chassis. The E8 was not revolutionary. It did not fundamentally redesign the Sherman's architecture or armor layout. Instead, it addressed the tank's most critical deficiencies through focused improvements. The engineers widened the tracks from 16 inches to 23 inches, significantly reducing ground pressure and improving mobility in mud and snow. They installed a new horizontal volute spring suspension system, the HVSS, which replaced the old vertical volute springs and provided a smoother ride, better cross-country speed, and improved accuracy while moving. Most importantly, they mounted the 76mm high-velocity gun in a new turret design with a more efficient shape and better armor distribution. The result was still recognizably a Sherman, but it was a Sherman transformed, faster, more maneuverable, better armed, and with handling characteristics that finally allowed American crews to exploit their advantages in training and fire control. The first EZ-8s reached Europe in December 1944, just as the Battle of the Bulge erupted across the Ardennes. They were issued initially to elite units, the 2nd and 3rd Armor Divisions, certain independent tank battalions attached to infantry divisions. The crews who received them noticed the differences immediately. The wider tracks and new suspension made the tank feel more stable, less prone to throwing a track on rough terrain. The 76mm gun, while not equal to the German 88mm, was sufficient to penetrate a Panther's side armor at normal combat ranges and could defeat even frontal armor if loaded with the new HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, ammunition that began arriving in January 1945. Most significantly, the improved fire control and gun stabilization meant the EZ-8 could engage effectively while moving, a capability that German tanks, with their superior guns but inferior stabilization systems, could not match. The German tankers noticed too. After-action reports from Panzer units in late 1944 and early 1945 begin to mention encounters with new model Shermans that behaved differently from earlier variants. A report from Panzer Lehr Division in January 1945 notes, enemy tank destroyed at 800 meters revealed itself to be a Sherman variant with wider tracks and improved suspension. This vehicle exhibited superior maneuverability and was able to engage accurately while in motion. Our Panther was hit twice before achieving the kill shot. Recommend increased caution when engaging this type. The transformation was not merely technical but tactical and psychological. American tank crews, who had spent 6 months learning to fear German armor, began to fight with renewed confidence. The EZ-8 gave them a platform that could compete, that allowed them to use their training and numerical superiority without the fatalistic certainty of death in every engagement. They learned to leverage the Sherman's quick turret traverse, its excellent optics, its reliability. They learned that against German armor weakened by fuel shortages, manned by increasingly inexperienced crews, the EZ-8 was more than adequate. It was, in many circumstances, superior. This brings us back to that nameless village west of the Rhine, to that morning in March 1945, when the lieutenant from Pennsylvania waits in his EZ-8 for the approaching Panther. The German tank emerges from the mist, its long gun traversing, searching. Is a Panther OSF. One of the last production models, with enhanced armor and the high-velocity KWK-42 gun that has terrorized Allied armor since its introduction at Kursk in 1943. The German crew has been fighting since the Eastern Front. They have killed T-34s and Churchills and Shermans. They have survived Normandy and the Bulge. They know their vehicle is superior to anything the Americans possess. They have heard the intelligence reports about new Sherman variants, but intelligence reports are abstract. The reality is that they have yet to encounter a Sherman that could stand against them in a fair fight. The lieutenant does not give them a fair fight. The EZ-8's engine roars to life, and the tank surges forward with a speed that surprises the German crew. It cuts left behind a building, tracks churning through rubble, turret traversing with hydraulic smoothness. The Panther fires, the 75mm shell screaming through the space where the Sherman had been a half-second earlier. The German gunner curses, cranks the turret to track the target, but the EZ-8 is already moving again, exploiting the Panther's slower traverse rate. The American gunner, a 20-year-old sergeant from Ohio, centers his sight picture on the Panther's glassy plate, exhales, and fires. The 76mm HVAP round hits the Panther just below the gun mantlet, a small target but a weak point in the armor scheme. The tungsten cord penetrator punches through, and the German tank erupts in flame. The crew bails out, 2 men on fire, 3 more staggering in shock. The engagement has lasted 45 seconds. The lieutenant reports the kill over the radio, his voice steady, professional. He does not celebrate. There will be more Panthers, more fights. But he has learned something in those 45 seconds, something that every EZ-8 crew is learning in 100 villages and towns across Germany in the spring of 1945. The laughter has stopped. By April 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin from east and west, over 2,000 EZ-8s were in service in Europe. They spearheaded the final drives across Germany, fought in the Ruhr pocket, crossed the Elbe. They encountered fewer and fewer German tanks as fuel starvation and parts shortages paralyzed the Wehrmacht's armored forces, but when they did fight, they fought as equals. The kill-loss ratios, which had so favored German armor in 1944, evened out. American tankers no longer went into battle expecting to die. They went expecting to win. The final verdict on the Sherman, and specifically on the EZ-8 variant, is complex and contested. Historians have debated for decades whether the Army's early design choices were justified, whether the casualties of 1944 could have been avoided, whether American industrial strategy traded lives for production efficiency. The numbers offer no simple answers. The United States produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war, an achievement unmatched by any other nation. German factories produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,350 Tigers, vastly superior vehicles individually, but utterly inadequate in number. The Americans lost over 6,000 Shermans in Europe, but they always had more. The Germans lost fewer tanks numerically, but each loss was irreplaceable, each dead crew impossible to replace with men of equivalent training and experience. What is certain is that the American tankers who fought in Normandy, in the Bulge, in the Hurtgen Forest, paid a terrible price for decisions made in design bureaus and procurement offices years before they ever saw combat. They paid the price in burns and shrapnel wounds, in friends incinerated, in the knowledge that their vehicle was inadequate, and that they were expected to compensate with courage and sacrifice. And yet they fought, and they won. They won not because the Sherman was the best tank of a war. It was not, but because they were numerous enough, brave enough, and eventually well-equipped enough to overwhelm an enemy that could not replace its losses and could not adapt its tactics to a changing battlefield. The EZ-8 arrived too late to save thousands of lives, but arrived in time to matter. It gave American tank crews a weapon that could compete, that could leverage their training and numbers without requiring suicidal tactics. It proved that American industry, when properly focused, could produce not just quantity, but quality. And most importantly, it demonstrated a principle that would define American military technology for the rest of the century: the willingness to acknowledge failure, to adapt, to improve. The German tankers who had laughed at the Sherman in 1944 were not laughing in 1945. Those who survived the war, and many did not, remembered the EZ-8 as the harbinger of their defeat. Not because it was invincible, but because it was good enough, and there were thousands of them, crewed by young men who had learned how to fight and were no longer afraid. Otto Carius, the Panzer ace who had dismissed the Sherman as a coffin, wrote years later, by the end they had learned. Their new tanks were still not equal to our Panthers, but they were close enough. And they had so many. We could kill 10, and 20 would take their place. We could not win that mathematics. The epilogue to this story is written in the landscape of post-war Europe, in the hundreds of EZ-8s that remained in service long after the last German tank fell silent. They fought in Korea, where their reliability and firepower proved decisive against North Korean T-34s in the early months of the war. They served with Allied armies well into the 1960s, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design once its critical flaws were addressed. And they stand now in museums and memorials across America and Europe, preserved as artifacts of a transformation, from hubris to humility, from failure to adaptation, from laughter to silence. The lieutenant from Pennsylvania survived the war. He returned to a small town in the Alleghenies, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and never spoke about what he saw in that village west of the Rhine. But in his workshop, mounted on the wall above his workbench, he kept a piece of steel track 23 inches wide, scarred with wear but still solid, still functional. Visitors who asked about it received only a small smile and a cryptic answer. "That's what got me home." He understood, even if he could not articulate it, that the track represented something larger than itself, the capacity of free men and free societies to learn from mistakes, to adapt, to improve, to face a superior enemy, and find a way to win not through brilliance or technological dominance, but through persistence and pragmatism, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. This is the larger truth that the Easy 8 embodies, the lesson written in steel and blood across the battlefields of Europe in 1945. Democracies are slow to anger, slow to mobilize, prone to error and inefficiency. They produce weapons committees, compromise, industrial logic, rather than warrior perfection. They send men to war in vehicles that are good enough rather than best in class. But democracies can learn. They can change. They can take a failed design and transform it into a war winner through the simple expedient of acknowledging reality and adapting to it. Tyrannies, for all their efficiency and technological prowess, are brittle. They cannot admit error without threatening the myth of infallibility upon which their authority rests. They cannot adapt because adaptation implies that the original design was flawed, and flawed designs come from flawed thinking, and flawed thinking cannot be tolerated in systems built on the cult of perfection. The German tankers laughed at the Sherman because they believed their technological superiority reflected ideological superiority, that their better tanks proved their better system. They were wrong. The Easy 8 proved them wrong. Not because it was a better tank than the Panther, it was not, but because it was good enough, and there were enough of them, and they were crewed by men from a society that valued results over doctrine, lives over theory, victory over pride. The laughter stopped not in a single moment, but across 1,000 small battlefields, in nameless villages and forgotten crossroads, where American tankers in upgunned, wide-track Shermans met German armor and no longer flinched, no longer calculated the odds of their own death, but fought with the confidence of men who knew their weapon was adequate and their cause was just. That confidence, built on steel tracks and 76mm guns, and the willingness to admit error and correct it, proved more valuable than all the engineering genius that produced the Panther and the Tiger. It was the confidence of free men fighting for a free society, armed at last with weapons that gave them a chance. And in the end, a chance was all they needed.